Dean, and today we're talking about how God always remembers His promises and how faithful God is in our life. We're talking about Genesis chapter 8 and what happens after God flooded the earth. And a couple of things about this is I want you to see in Genesis 8, God talks about how God remembered, and that emphasis is on remembered Noah. It was after 150 days and about 5 months when the water finally stopped and the wind blew. God remember, and God sent the wind to blow over the earth and to begin to dry the ground and the land again. And so this wind blew and the land became dry. And but God remembered Noah, and I want to get back to that here in a few minutes. And then when Noah was still on the ark, he opened this window or this covering of the boat, and he released. Remember, he released two different birds. He released a raven that never came back, that kept on flying to try to find dry ground, never could find dry ground. Then he released a dove, and when the first time he released it, it couldn't find dry ground. It came back. The second time he released it, that the dove flew and actually came back carrying an olive branch. And then the third time that Noah released the dove, that it didn't come back because basically it found dry ground, and it could thrive. And but Noah was about 601 years old. And for about 10 and a half months, he and his family and all these animals stayed on this boat on the ark. And then God told Noah, he said, to leave the boat. And then Noah's response after leaving the boat, being on this ark, was to build an altar to God and to worship God. And it pleased God so much. Noah pleased God so much that God sent basically a rainbow and a promise and covenant to Noah that God would never again destroy the earth, the world, with water. And a couple applications about this is I want you to see today is that God remembers His promises. I don't know what promises God's given you. He's spoken to you about some things about His Word. Maybe God spoke some promises over your life at a youth camp or kids camp or when you were a little boy or a little girl. But I want you to know and remember today that God remembers you. Did you hear me? Did you hear me today? God remembers you. He's not forgotten you. He's not forgotten the promises He's made to you. He's going to fulfill those promises. And then I put here also is that what are some things that you need to release and let go of? And I think it's interesting is that maybe the problem that we have not, maybe the reason why we not received God's promises in our life yet is because God's waiting for us to release some things. And so what areas in your life do you need to release to God and trust God with? Maybe you haven't released your finances and learn to trust God in your finances and your giving and your tithing. Maybe you haven't released your faith and you're putting your faith and hope in God because someone's hurt you in the past. But what do you need to release so God can bless your life and fulfill His promises for your life? I also put here is that God's timing is not always our timing. Think about Noah and his wife and family, and think about this time. What was it? 10.5 months that they were on this ark. I'm sure that their timing would not want to be on an ark full of animals, stinky animals, for 10.5 months. And so remember that God's timing is not always our timing. And so even when we don't see God working and moving, God's still working and moving. And but we need to think about, remember His timeline and not try to control God based upon our timeline and our things. A couple other things before I'm done today, and I again appreciate you watching, is this. I want to say don't leave something. If you know God's spoken to you about staying and being somewhere, don't leave it until God says to leave it. It's really important. You got to understand when God says something, that's when you need to respond and react and do what He says to do. Sometimes I feel like we move too quickly. Imagine if Noah moved too quickly before God said and to open and to that the land is dry. And so we need to trust God and don't do anything unless God spoke to our heart to do it, and that's when we need to do it. But again, don't leave something. If God has spoken to you about something, don't leave it. Don't change it. Don't move it. Don't manipulate that time until God has said something else to you in order to leave it or do something differently. And then the last thing is I want to ask you is, are you looking for opportunities to build an altar to God and worship God and thank God for His goodness and His faithfulness? Isn't that interesting that when Noah and his family left the ark, the first thing he did was build an altar to God. And I want to encourage you to build an altar to God. And you're thinking, well, Dean, how do I do that? And building an altar to God is spending time in God's Word and spending time praying and listening to God, and spend time worshiping God every chance you get, and thanking God every chance you get. You look around and just be thankful for what God's provided for you and His faithfulness in your life. And so here's my prayer today. My prayer is this: that God would help us remember that He never forgets. He never forgets His promises, and that we would always look for opportunities to worship God. He is powerful and He is faithful. So I pray that's a blessing to you. Remember that you matter to me, but more importantly, you matter to God. I'm praying for you. God bless you. Have a great day.